May 10th, 1940. The morning air above the Netherlands is still, almost peaceful. Buiten the sky above Amsterdam, something is about to change. A dozen sleek, twin-engine fighters bank into formation, their engines humming in perfect synchronization. These are the Fokker GI, a design that the German Luftwaffe never expected to encounter. They called Etel Foscher, the Reaper, and in the next 5 days, these outgunned pilots flying this forgotten fighter would make the Germans pay a price in blood and confusion that they didn't see coming. This is the story of how a small nation's homegrown aircraft nearly changed the course of a war before it had barely begun. The Fokker GI was born from contradiction. In the 1930s, while other nations were obsessing over sleek monoplane fighters like the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt, the Dutch aircraft designer Frederik Fokker was thinking differently. He believed the future of air combat lay not in a single engine, Buiten two. 2 engines meant range. 2 engines meant firepower. 2 engines meant an aircraft that could carry enough weapons to dominate the sky. He was right, but the world wasn't ready to listen. The aircraft that emerged from his drawings was unlike anything flying in Europe. A twin-engine design with a narrow fuselage, twin booms extending back from the engines, and a greenhouse canopy perched between them like a watchtower. The cockpit offered pilots a view that was almost supernatural for the era. From up there, a pilot could see everything. Every angle, every approach, every escape route. Inside, the design was ruthlessly efficient. 4 forward-firing machine guns mounted in the nose where the pilot could control the aim directly. Synchronized, deadly, and concentrated where it mattered most. By 1939, the first production aircraft were rolling off the line. The Dutch called it the GIA. The world barely noticed. Then came the warnings. In early 1940, as tensions across Europe crept toward breaking point, Dutch intelligence began picking up chatter. German preparations. German mobilization. The Dutch government knew what was coming. They knew Hitler had made his intentions clear, and they knew their air force was pitifully unprepared. 23 GI fighters existed when the invasion warnings began. 23 against an entire air force that had proven itself in Poland and was now preparing to roll westward. 23 aircraft. That was all the Dutch had. May 9th, 1940. The night before, everything changed. Dutch pilots were already sleeping at their bases when the first reports came in. German paratroopers landing near Rotterdam. Panzer columns crossing the Belgian border. This was it. Operation Fall Gelb had begun. The German invasion of the Low Countries was underway. By dawn, the GAD airfields were alive with activity. Mechanics were fueling aircraft, arming them, running through checklists. The pilots, most of them younger men who had never fired a shot in anger, were suiting up for the first combat mission of their lives. They had no idea what was about to happen. May 10th, 1940, just after dawn, the first Fokker GI fighters took off into a sky already filled with German bombers and fighters. The Luftwaffe had expected air superiority to be easy. The Dutch Air Force was supposed to be a minor inconvenience, quickly swept aside by superior numbers and training. What they found instead was something that made their pilots actually hesitate. The GI was faster than they expected, more maneuverable, and that concentrated firepower in the nose, it was devastating. In the first 2 hours of combat, flying in loose formations that allowed their pilots to use that exceptional visibility to its fullest, the Dutch destroyed at least 13 German aircraft. Bombers caught on approach, fighters surprised in split-second engagements. The Luftwaffe pilots used to easy victories, were suddenly getting killed by an enemy they hadn't prepared for. But numbers were destiny. For 5 days, from May 10th to May 15th, 1940, the Fokker GI fought a battle it could never win. Every day brought more German aircraft. Every day brought fewer Dutch fighters. The attrition was terrible. Aircraft went down. Pilots didn't come back. The surviving crews flew sortie after sortie, knowing with perfect clarity that this would end only one way. Not because they weren't good pilots, they were excellent. Not because the GI wasn't a capable fighter, it was. But because you cannot hold back an entire nation's military with 23 aircraft, no matter how well designed. May 15th, 1940. The 5th day, Rotterdam was burning. German paratroopers controlled key airfields. The Dutch government was evacuating. It was over. The pilots of the surviving Fokker GI fighters were given orders to fly to England if they could, or destroy their aircraft and surrender if they couldn't. Of the 23 GI fighters that had started this battle 5 days earlier, only a handful remained. Most had been shot down. Some had been destroyed on the ground. The ones that survived were piloted by exhausted men who had fought beyond any reasonable expectation. They had proven something that day. They had proven that courage and a good aircraft could hurt an enemy, could make them bleed, could make them recalculate, but they could not, in the process, stop them. What made the Fokker GI remarkable was not just what it accomplished in those 5 days. It was what it represented. It was a design born from clear thinking about what air combat actually needed. It was proof that sometimes a smaller nation with limited resources could produce something truly exceptional. The GI could have changed everything if there had been more of them. If the Dutch had started production 2 years earlier, if they had built 100 instead of 23. But history doesn't trade in ifs. It only records what actually happened. The story of the Fokker GI was almost lost. After the war, most of the surviving aircraft were scrapped. The Dutch, occupied for 4 years, had no means to maintain military aircraft. The Germans, facing defeat, had other priorities. The British and Americans, focused on their own designs, saw little reason to preserve a relic of a fallen nation's brief moment of defiance. But the aircraft lived on in memory, in the accounts of the pilots who flew it, in the reports of the German pilots who feared it, in the historical record as a small but shining example of what determination and good engineering could achieve against impossible odds. Today, the Fokker GI exists primarily in photographs and museum displays. A few examples survive in aviation museums, preserved as testaments to a moment that lasted only 5 days but echoed across decades. When people look at those preserved aircraft, they see something that modern aviation has mostly forgotten: the importance of vision, of seeing the battlefield clearly, of having the firepower to matter when it counted. The GI gave its pilots the ability to see everything and strike with precision. In an age of radar and long-range missiles, we have traded away that clarity for distance. We can hit targets miles away, but we cannot see them the way those Dutch pilots saw their enemies from inside that greenhouse canopy, close enough to count the rivets on a German bomber's fuselage. The Fokker GI was called the Reaper for the deadly harvest it reaped in the opening hours of the German invasion. Booty was also, in its own way, a symbol of something else. Symbol of a small nation that refused to go quietly into the night. 23 aircraft against the entire Wehrmacht. 5 days of defiance. 13 German aircraft destroyed in the first chaotic hours of combat. These are the numbers that matter. These are the facts that were entered into the historical record. This was what the Dutch managed to accomplish with nothing but courage, good training, and one of the finest fighter aircraft of the era. When the Netherlands finally fell on May 15, 1940, German officers studied the wreckage of the Fokker GI with a mixture of respect and irritation. Here was an aircraft they hadn't been prepared for. Here was a design that, if deployed in greater numbers, could have caused them serious problems. The reports that came back from the Luftwaffe were clear and consistent. The GI was a dangerous opponent, fast, well-armed, and flown by pilots who understood the importance of aggressive tactics and proper use of their superior visibility. If the Dutch had been able to field 50 GI fighters instead of 23, the opening phase of the invasion might have gone very differently, but that was not the hand history dealt. The surviving Fokker GI aircraft were eventually captured by the Germans, who examined them carefully, copied some of their features, and filed them away in the great archive of what might have beens. A few examples made it to England with Dutch pilots who escaped. These aircraft continued to serve in reconnaissance and training roles, keeping alive the memory of what these small twin-engine fighters had accomplished. But their moment of glory had passed. The war moved on. Newer fighters, with greater range and firepower, took to the skies. The GI, having done its part, faded into history. Yet the Fokker GI deserves to be remembered. Not as a failure. 5 days of resistance against overwhelming odds is no failure, but as a reminder that smaller nations can produce exceptional military hardware, a reminder that good design matters, a reminder that a well-designed aircraft in the hands of courageous pilots can accomplish extraordinary things, even when the odds are mathematically impossible. The Fokker GI was forgotten by history for decades. Aviation historians focused on the fighters that survived the war, the Spitfire, the Mustang, the Messerschmitt. But slowly, over the years, researchers began to dig deeper into the archives. They found pilot testimonies. They found Luftwaffe reports. They found the photographs and the technical drawings. And they began to understand what had actually happened in those 5 days in May 1940. They discovered the Reaper. Today, when you see a Fokker GI in a museum, you are looking at one of the rarest aircraft in the world. You are looking at a machine that was built in small numbers, that flew for a brief moment in history, and that made an impression so profound that German pilots remembered it and recorded ITIN official reports. You are looking at evidence of a small nation's ingenuity and determination. You are looking at what happens when designers think clearly about what air combat actually requires, and when engineers execute that vision with skill and precision. The story of the Fokker GI is not just about aircraft design. It's about courage. It's about refusing to accept defeat before the battle has even started. It's about 23 pilots and ground crew who knew their odds were terrible, who knew their nation was about to be overrun, but who nevertheless climbed into their aircraft and flew directly toward the enemy. It is about the last message sent by the last surviving GI pilot, who reported that he was going to crash his aircraft into a German bomber rather than allow it to be captured. That spirit, that willingness to sacrifice everything, that is what the Reaper represents. When we think about the opening hours of World War II in Western Europe, we usually think about the overwhelming German victory, the rapid collapse of the Dutch and Belgian forces, the encirclement of the French army, the eventual surrender. And yes, that is what happened. But for 5 days, In a small corner of that vast catastrophe, something different was happening. 23 Fokker G.I. fighters were writing a different story. A story of defiance. A story of skill meeting courage. A story of an aircraft that, against all odds, proved itself to be exactly what its designers had promised it would be. The Fokker G. I never got the recognition it deserved. No books were written about it by the victors. No museum exhibits celebrated its achievements. It was simply too small, too brief, too insignificant in the grand scheme of the war. But for those who study aircraft, design, and air combat history, the GI stands as a monumental clarity of thought and careful engineering. It stands as proof that sometimes the right design in the right hands, at the right moment, can accomplish the impossible. So here's the question I want to leave you with. What would have happened if the Netherlands had ordered 100 Fokker G.I. fighters instead of 23? What if they had started production 3 years earlier, instead of just before the war? What if they had equipped an entire air force with this capable twin-engine design? Would the German invasion have been delayed? Would the air campaign over the Low Countries have gone differently? Would 100 GI fighters have been able to hold the Luftwaffe at bay long enough for British reinforcements to arrive? These are the questions that historians have debated for decades. And the answer is, we will never know. But fact that the question is worth asking tells you something about just how capable this forgotten fighter truly was. If you're fascinated by lesser-known World War II aircraft and the pilots who flew them, hit like so YouTube shows this to more people. And subscribe because next time we are diving into the aircraft that was supposed to be the German answer to everything the Fokker G.I. threw at them. The Messerschmitt Bf 110, the heavy fighter that was supposed to dominate the skies, but instead became a liability faster than anyone expected. The story of ambition, engineering mistakes, and what happens when you design a fighter for a war that never comes. Subscribe so you don't miss it. Thanks for watching.